She kept her head down during rounds because Hargrove's eyes were always looking for a reason to prove she didn't belong here. 3 years at Mercy General in Norfolk, 3 years of watching him move through the trauma bays like a man collecting debts, and Megan O'Brien had learned the single rule that kept her invisible: don't be right when he was wrong. The fluorescent lights above the nurse's station buzzed their endless mechanical hum, the kind of sound that burrowed into your skull during night shift and never quite left. Megan restocked the crash cart with methodical precision, airway equipment first, then the cardiac drugs, each item exactly where it needed to be if someone's heart decided to stop. Her hands moved with the kind of confidence that only came from having done this 10,000 times before, but Dr. Hargrove wasn't looking at her hands. He was looking at the way residents gravitated toward her when they had questions. The unit patch was still there, hidden where nobody could see it. She touched it sometimes when she sat alone on her break, the faded embroidered Navy Special Warfare Group insignia rough under her fingertips like a prayer she couldn't say out loud. Ramadi, 2005. She didn't think about that anymore, or at least that's what she told herself at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and the tremor started in her hands. The tremor was her body's memory. Her hand shook when she held her coffee cup in the break room, a small involuntary movement that made her look fragile, breakable, exactly like someone Hargrove could dismiss. But the moment she touched a patient, a hand on a shoulder, fingers checking a pulse, palm steady while drawing blood, the shaking stopped. Muscle memory took over. Her body remembered who she actually was, even if her voice had learned to make herself small. At 2,100 hours, the emergency department doors hissed open and Megan was already moving toward the sound. That was the thing about working trauma for 18 years, 7 of those years invisible, 11 before that when people still knew her name. You learned to read the air pressure changes. The ambulance lights threw red and blue across the ER bay windows like warning signals, and the radio crackled with dispatch information. Trauma alert, male, 38, multiple penetrating injuries to anterior thorax and abdomen, stable vitals en route, ETA 6 minutes. Megan had the trauma protocol up in her mind before the dispatcher finished speaking. O negative, blood already flagged in the bank, trauma bay 2 cleaned and ready, surgical instruments laid out in the precise order they'd be needed. She'd done this enough times that her hands could prepare for a trauma while her voice stayed quiet and her eyes stayed on the floor when Hargrove walked past. He was already there, of course, straightening his white coat in that gesture he'd perfected over the years, a movement designed to remind everyone in the room that he was the one who mattered here. Dr. Hargrove had the kind of presence that made junior residents nervous and nurses careful with their words. His power wasn't just institutional, though he had plenty of that. His power came from control. He controlled the pace of rounds, the allocation of resources, the narrative about who was competent and who wasn't. He'd spent 3 years carefully establishing that Megan was the latter. During rounds this morning, she'd mentioned to the medical team that their protocol for post-operative breathing exercises wasn't aligned with the current evidence base, a quiet observation, backed by the latest literature, the kind of thing that improved patient outcomes. Hargrove had looked at her like she'd suggested they start treating patients with leeches. "Thank you for your input, Ms. O'Brien," he'd said, the kind of tone that made thank you sound like an insult. The residents had exchanged glances. The message was clear: she wasn't worth listening to. By noon, all 3 of those residents were asking Hargrove about breathing exercises. He'd taken credit for her research within 6 hours. Megan started and 4 in the practice model during downtime, smooth insertion on the first stick despite her trembling hands. She watched herself do it, watched the needle slide through skin with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory and repetition and something deeper, something that lived in the scarred tissue of her forearms. Those scars looked like nothing from here under the fluorescent lights, old burns that could have been kitchen accidents or accidental splashes or 100 other things that normal people survived. But up close, if anyone ever looked close enough, they'd see the pattern, the way they tracked along her wrists and up toward her inner elbows in lines that suggested she'd been holding something hot. She'd been holding 3 Navy SEALs together under fire for 9 hours in Ramadi, their blood and sweat and her own blood soaked into her uniform, her hand steady while everything around her fell apart. She wasn't supposed to remember that. The Navy had made that very clear when they told her to disappear, to never surface, that the operation officially never happened and she was a ghost who'd saved men who didn't exist. But ghosts could still save lives, even if nobody was allowed to know it. Especially if nobody was allowed to know it. The trauma alert siren wailed closer, and Megan felt her entire body align into combat readiness, breathing shallow and controlled, eyes sharp, every sense tuned to incoming threat. Except it wasn't a threat. It was a patient who needed help. That was the difference between then and now, the thing that allowed her to wake up some mornings and believe she'd actually left Ramadi behind. She wasn't in a war anymore. She was in a hospital in Norfolk where people trusted her with their lives even if nobody trusted her with respect. Hargrove was already giving orders, his voice moving through the trauma team like a general commanding troops. Let's get monitor placement ready. I want 2 large bore lines the second that patient comes through the door. Somebody page the attending surgeon. The resident snapped to attention. This was his theater, the only place where he felt completely in control. Megan moved to the medication station without being asked, pulling the emergency medications they might need and arranging them where the attending surgeon could reach them in seconds if things went south. This was her role, invisible preparation, essential work that would never be attributed to her. She could live with that. She'd lived with worse. The doors burst open and the paramedics brought the patient in on the stretcher, the kind of controlled chaos that separated good trauma teams from fractured ones. Male, mid-30s, bleeding from at least 3 visible wounds across his chest and abdomen. The paramedic was talking, GSW to the left anterior thorax, entry wound 2 centimeters below the second intercostal space. We've got a tension pneumo we decompressed in the field, vitals are stable for now but we had some hypertension at scene. Megan was already moving, positioning herself to get the for established before the attending could ask for one, anticipating the next move before it was ordered. Hargrove was right there too, his hand on the patient's shoulder, his voice steady and authoritative. You're at Mercy General now, you're going to be fine, we have the best team in Virginia. The patient's eyes were glassy, shock beginning to set in, but his lips moved like he was trying to say something. I need a Brian, the patient said, his voice thin and barely audible over the monitors already bleeping out his vital signs. Is there an O'Brien here? The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator preparing for potential intubation. Hargrove's entire body stiffened. His hand, which had been reassuring on the patient's shoulder, tightened into something resembling possession. Megan was already moving toward the stretcher with a 16-gauge needle and tubing, her face neutral, her eyes on the 4 placement. She didn't look at Hargrove. She didn't acknowledge what the patient had said. She just worked, her hand steady in that particular way they became when everything else fell away. The truth was something you couldn't hide forever, no matter how well you learned to be invisible. And the moment someone said her name out loud in this hospital, everything changed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove heard it too, and now he knew. He knew that this patient knew her, that she had some connection to someone important enough to ask for by name. And Hargrove couldn't tolerate mysteries. He couldn't tolerate anything he didn't control. His eyes locked on Megan with the intensity of a predator that had just caught a scent of blood in the water. Get the attending surgeon down here now, Hargrove said, his voice sharp enough to cut. And someone explain to me why this patient is asking for a nurse. Nobody answered. The trauma team moved around the stretcher with precision, drawing blood, getting a second full line, preparing for the operating room. Megan finished her 4 placement with a smooth practice motion, needle in, flash of red blood in the tube, cap twisted into place, and stepped back. Her hand brushed against the unit patch inside her jacket, the faded Navy Special Warfare Group insignia await against her ribs. 3 years of being invisible, 3 years of letting Hargrove believe she was nothing special, and it was about to end. She could feel it like a change in air pressure, like the moment before a helicopter blade starts to rotate. The night shift at Mercy General was about to become something entirely different. The stretcher wheeled through the ER entrance at 2,247 hours, and everything changed. The Navy SEAL from Ramadi lay on canvas stained dark with his own blood, shrapnel wounds across his torso, chest wrapped in field dressings that had already soaked through twice. His wife followed, face white as bone. 2 grown children trailed behind, their military bearing giving away a lifetime of watching loved ones return broken from deployments that never got discussed at dinner. The monitors screamed soft electronic warnings as they moved past Trauma Bay 3. Megan stood at the medication station, hand steady as surgery itself, and that's when the SEAL's eyes fluttered open. Just barely. His lips moved, and what came out was a whisper that stopped everyone mid-stride. "O'Brien. Need O'Brien." The wife's face twisted. How does he know? Megan was already moving forward, muscle memory from 1,000 similar moments, but Hargrove stepped into her path like a man drawing a line in sand. He positioned himself between her and the stretcher, his body blocking her from the family's view, blocking her from the patient's line of sight. His smile was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Nurse O'Brien," he said, his voice pitched low but carrying the weight of an announcement. "Step back. You are not this patient's provider." She met his eyes. "Sir, he asked for." "I heard what he said." Hargrove's voice cut like a scalpel. "What did you whisper to him?" "In the ambulance bay. I saw you lean close." The hallway had gone quiet. People stopped moving. The wife watched. The children watched. A resident froze mid-step. This was the moment Hargrove had been waiting for, not the treatment, not the patient. The opportunity. The trap. Megan took a measured breath. The kind of breath taught in extraction protocols when rounds are incoming. "I told him his commanding officer cares about his men. That's all." It wasn't a lie. She'd said, "Daniel is proud of you, sir." But that wasn't what Hargrove heard. What he heard was opportunity. He turned to face the wife fully, abandoning any pretense of professionalism. His movements were deliberate, theatrical. "Mrs. Patterson, I sincerely apologize for this situation. Your husband has formed an emotional attachment to this nurse, a clear breach of protocol. She has compromised her clinical judgment. This kind of emotional compromise is exactly why we maintain strict boundaries." The words landed like punches. The wife's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to anger all in sequence, as if Hargrove had just explained away her husband's dying wish as the delusion of a man being seduced by a predatory caregiver. "I assure you she will be removed from his care immediately," Hargrove continued, already walking toward the nurse's station. He pulled out a red marker, not blue, not black, red. He wrote directly on the unit board where every staff member would see it before shift change. "O'Brien, written warning. Unauthorized patient contact. Emotionally unstable." The handwriting was careful, almost calligraphic. The kind of documentation that didn't look like anger. It looked like evidence. 23 staff members worked Mercy General's night shift. Megan knew exactly how many because she'd counted once, during a quiet moment at 0400 when she couldn't sleep. 23 people saw that message. The charge nurse saw it. The resident saw it. The janitorial staff saw it. By morning, everyone would have seen it. The break room at 0100 was a graveyard of flickering fluorescent lights and a coffee maker that had stopped working 3 months ago. Megan sat alone at the corner table with a cup of cold coffee, the kind that forms a skin on top if you let it sit long enough. She let it sit. 4 nurses entered. She watched their faces register her presence, the micro-expressions, the slight hesitation. One of them, a nurse named Cortez who'd worked beside Megan for 14 months without incident, turned back toward the door. The others followed. As Cortez passed, close enough to be heard but quiet enough to be deniable, she whispered, "Such a drama queen." Loud enough. Intentional. The kind of cruelty that looks like accident if you question it. Megan didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the cold coffee, watching the surface reflect the broken lights above. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly how to break a man's neck with your bare hands and choosing not to. The kind of restraint that comes from being trained by people who specialized in controlled violence, in understanding that power is most potent when it's silent. She heard the break room door close. Heard their voices fade down the hallway. Heard one of them laugh, not at her, just laughing, the kind of laugh that means they'd already moved on to something else. That's what hurt, she would later admit to herself in the parking lot at 0600 when she finally broke. Not the cruelty. The indifference. At the nurse's station, Hargrove was making phone calls. 3 of them. The first went to Richard Chen, a board member who'd been Hargrove's residency mentor 15 years ago. We have a situation. The O'Brien situation. She's a liability. Forming inappropriate attachments with patients, boundary violations. The voice on the other end was inaudible, but Megan could hear the murmur of agreement before Hargrove hung up. The second call went to Patricia Walsh, who controlled admissions and staffing decisions. I need you to pull her file. All of it. Go back 18 months. I'm documenting a pattern, and I need to show the board that this isn't an isolated incident. The third call was to the hospital's investigator. I'm requesting a formal inquiry. This nurse is practicing beyond her scope of practice, and I have documented evidence on the unit board. I also have multiple staff members who can confirm her emotional instability. Documentation. Pattern. Multiple witnesses. Hargrove wasn't yelling anymore. He was being strategic. He was being competent. He was building a case, and it would have worked on anyone else. It would have worked on her if she hadn't learned a long time ago that paper trails leave fingerprints. Megan returned to her station at 0127 and began charting the SEAL's vitals. Her hands moved with precision, each keystroke deliberate. Her jaw was locked tight enough that her teeth would ache by morning, but her voice would stay level. Her breathing would stay controlled. One tear escaped down her left cheek at 0133, sliding down her face like rain on a window. She didn't blink. She didn't look away from the monitor. Her hand came up, not quickly, not with emotion, and she wiped the tear away without breaking stride, without pausing in her documentation. Then she stood, walked directly to where Hargrove was finishing another chart, and met his eyes. Sir, with respect, she said, her voice like a blade folded in cloth, that patient knows exactly who I am. Hargrove's smile was the kind a predator gives right before it understands it's not the top of the food chain. Not for much longer, Nurse O'Brien. She turned and walked back to her station, and that's when the night went quiet in a way that meant something fundamental had shifted. The alarms would come at 0300. The crisis would arrive like an avalanche. But for now, in the fluorescent silence of Mercy General's night shift, 2 people understood something the rest of the hospital didn't. One of them was pretending to be in control. The other was pretending to care. The monitor screamed at 0300. 3 distinct alarms layered over each other like discordant music, the ventilator's mechanical gasp, the cardiac monitor's staccato shriek, the blood pressure cuff cycling and finding nothing it wanted to report. Megan was already moving before the first alarm finished its first wail, her body understanding what her eyes were still confirming on the monitor above the bed, heart rate dropping, blood pressure collapsing, muffled heart sounds that shouldn't be muffled. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the sac around the heart like a vice tightening. She was in the SEAL's room before the night nurse finished reaching for the call button. Distended neck veins. Pale. The man's eyes flickered open for half a second, confused, drowning in his own chest. Megan's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 9 hours under fire in Ramadi holding 3 SEALs together while rounds snapped overhead and the dust turned rust-colored with blood she couldn't stop fast enough. But this wasn't Ramadi. This was a sterile room at Mercy General with fluorescent lights and a crash cart 15 feet away and all the tools she needed if anyone would let her use them. She didn't wait. The ultrasound machine was 3 rooms down. She grabbed it, wheeled it back, plugged it in while the monitor's screaming got worse. 72. 68. 59. The SEAL's lips were turning blue. She positioned the probe herself, watching the echo screen materialize, there, fluid where there shouldn't be fluid, a dark collection around the heart like water filling a glass. That wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove was calling the on-call surgeon. She could hear him through the open door, his voice steady and unhurried, the kind of voice that believed in its own importance. "We have a potential pericardial effusion. The surgeon's 15 minutes out. I'm calling it in now. 15 minutes. The seal would be dead in 4. Megan didn't answer to 15 minutes. She'd learned to answer to what the body told her, and this body was screaming. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, sterile field kit, her hand steady as surgical steel. The pericardiocentesis, guided needle puncture under ultrasound, drain the blood strangling the heart, was technically a physician procedure. Technically. But Megan had done it twice in Ramadi when the men bleeding out in front of her didn't have time for a physician to arrive. She had done it in an underground bunker with flashlight cones and incoming fire and a man's life depending on whether her needle hand was as steady as her faith. The night staff appeared in the doorway of the SEAL's room. She felt them watching through the glass partition. Felt their hesitation, their understanding that something was happening that shouldn't be happening, that Megan was crossing a line that had a name and consequences and paperwork. She didn't look at them. Prep the site. Chlorhexidine wipe. Sterile drape. Gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence. The ultrasound probe stayed in her left hand while her right hand found the angle, third intercostal space, just lateral of the sternum, the needle angling up toward the heart at 45 degrees. The monitor was still screaming. Heart rate in the 40s now. Pressure unmeasurable. The needle advanced. She felt the give of tissue, fascia, then the pericardial sac's resistance, then the sudden give as the needle penetrated through into the fluid. Blood immediately began flowing back through the syringe like dark wine. 20 ccs. 30. 40. The immediate relief was audible, the heart monitor's tone changed, shifted, found a rhythm it had lost. 60 ccs total, and the SEAL gasped. Actually gasped, a sound like a man breaking the surface after drowning, his eyes flying open, confusion clearing to something like recognition. "Senior Chief," he said, his voice raw and dreaming, not quite conscious enough to know he was speaking aloud. "Senior Chief, you're here." "Stable," Megan said quietly. Her own breathing was controlled, meditative, the way it always was when she'd just held death at arm's length and won. She was already capping the syringe, bagging the fluid, moving to the next step, the next minute, the next thing that had to be done. Sinus rhythm. "We're stable." The night nurse appeared in the doorway with genuine shock on her face. One of the residents was checking the ultrasound images, the numbers, the before and after, his mouth opening to form words he didn't have yet. But that wasn't the worst part. By 0600, Dr. Morrison came through, the actual on-call surgeon, and he examined the patient, examined Megan's work, examined the ultrasound images with the kind of careful attention that meant he understood exactly what he was looking at. "Perfect pericardiocentesis," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. He looked at Megan with something unfamiliar in his expression, not recognition, exactly, but the beginning of it. A recalibration happening in real time. "You saved his life." Megan nodded once. Exhaustion was starting to creep in now, the shaking that came after, the cost of 4 hours of pure focus finally being allowed to settle into her muscles. But she was still upright. Still steady. Still professional. Hargrove had already made 6 calls. By 0605, a hospital investigator named Gerald Frame was walking through the front doors with a leather briefcase that looked expensive and an expression that looked rehearsed. Frame was the type of man who wore his administration like a uniform, all pressed corners and careful distance. He went directly to Hargrove's office, and whatever conversation happened behind that closed door lasted exactly 12 minutes. Frame found Megan at the nurse's station. "Nurse O'Brien," he said, his voice polished and impersonal. "I need your badge and credentials. You're under investigation for practicing beyond the scope of your nursing license." The badge was in her pocket. She could feel its weight. She'd worn it for 3 years at Mercy General, clipped to her scrubs through 12-hour shifts, through 50 patient handoffs, Through every moment she'd learned to make herself smaller so she wouldn't threaten the men in white coats who needed to believe they were the only ones who understood how to save lives. She unclipped it slowly and handed it to Frame without speaking. Frame interviewed Dr. Morrison next, and Megan heard later what Morrison had said. She heard it from a resident who heard it from a nurse whose sister was in administration. Morrison had hesitated. She saved his life, he'd said carefully, but technically, yes, needle decompression is a physician procedure. I can't testify that she was within scope. That hesitation was enough. Hargrove had contacted Megan's nursing school references. Professor Linda Hayes received a call at her home, where she was grading papers at 9 in the morning. Did she ever show signs of instability? Hargrove had asked. Emotional volatility? Difficulty accepting physician authority? Hayes had said no. She'd said Megan was the most stable student she'd ever taught. But Hargrove had already hung up before she finished the sentence, and what Hayes didn't know was that he'd recorded part of the call, just enough to take out of context, just enough to suggest something uncertain had happened. Hargrove pulled her performance reviews going back 18 months. Every single time Megan had questioned a protocol, he'd documented it as insubordination. Every time she'd suggested a better approach, he'd noted it as disrespect. Competence had been reframed as arrogance. Attention to detail had become obsession. By the time he was finished, her file looked like the record of someone unstable, someone who'd finally cracked at 0300 and taken actions beyond her scope, not out of necessity, but out of some deeper psychological need to prove herself, to exceed authority, to be something she wasn't. Board member Chen reviewed the file Hargrove prepared. 20 incidents of protocol deviation. Patient complaints, fabricated, most of them, pulled from satisfaction surveys that had mentioned her name in passing and twisted into grievances. One sentence about her emotional volatility taken from a performance review about a medication error she'd caught and corrected before it happened. By 0800, Megan sat in the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. The windows overlooked the parking lot. Her badge was already on the desk, placed there by Hargrove himself, a small theatrical touch that meant submission before she'd even sat down. Pending investigation, Frame said, not looking at her, you're suspended without pay. Your hospital privileges are revoked. You're not to access the facility except to retrieve personal items from your locker. She nodded. She'd seen this before. Not here. In Ramadi. Different context, same machinery of power moving against one person, the same slow, careful destruction of credibility that happened when someone threatening the hierarchy needed to be removed quietly. At noon, security escorted her out. They didn't have to. She could have walked out with dignity, could have carried her head high, but Hargrove had requested an escort, and the security guards were just doing their job, and so they walked her through the main lobby of Mercy General where day shift staff were arriving, where patients' families were checking in at reception, where the coffee cart was being wheeled to its station. Staff turned away as she passed. She carried one box. Inside, a coffee mug from her son Daniel, a photograph of him in his dress uniform, a few personal items from her locker. The faded unit patch from her combat days was still sewn inside her jacket lining, next to her heart, where Hargrove would never find it, where no investigation could reach. She didn't look back as the security doors sealed behind her. The parking lot was wet from overnight rain. Her car was a 15-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better days, and she sat in it for 20 minutes with the engine off, watching the rain run down the windshield in patterns that looked almost like intention. Her hands were steady. They didn't shake. That was the thing about having held lives together under fire, everything else felt small, felt manageable, felt like something that had happened to someone else. But the VA hospital was across town, and she had to drive there eventually, had to sit in a waiting room with other people who carried invisible wounds, had to be called by her first name by someone who didn't know what that name meant, who didn't know that Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had saved 3 men in Ramadi that the Navy had spent 3 years trying to bury, that she carried decorations in a box under her bed that the government had officially erased from existence. She turned the key. The engine turned over. By the time she pulled into the VA hospital parking lot, something was already shifting. Something was already breaking. Because Hargrove had made one mistake, a mistake so fundamental that he'd never see it coming. He documented everything. Every call, every conversation, every strategic move to bury a woman who'd saved a Navy SEAL's life at 0300 in the morning. And somewhere in the system, someone was watching. The VA hospital waiting room smelled like old coffee and antiseptic, the kind of fluorescent-lit purgatory where time moved in circles. Megan sat in a plastic chair that stuck to the back of her scrubs. She'd changed out of uniform before coming here, choosing civilian clothes like armor she no longer knew how to wear. Around her, veterans filled the mold seats. One man's hands shook as he turned pages of a 3-year-old magazine without reading a single word. Another stared at the ceiling tile directly above his head, counting, always counting. A third sat perfectly still with his eyes closed, his breathing shallow as a man trying to disappear into the chair itself. She recognized the 1,000-yard stare. She'd worn it herself once, in a different lifetime, in a different country, under a sky that never stopped burning. Her name hadn't been called yet. The appointment was for 18:30, a tremor evaluation, the paperwork said. Post-traumatic stress response. Involuntary motor dysfunction. Medical words for things the Navy had ordered her never to speak about. The classified operation where she'd held 3 SEALs together for 9 hours under sustained enemy fire in Ramadi had left marks on her hands that didn't show on X-rays. Shrapnel wounds that never bled. The Navy had been very clear about the arrangement. She would take her honorable discharge, enroll in nursing school, disappear completely, and never acknowledge that Operation Silent Thunder had happened at all. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien would cease to exist. There would be no decorations to frame, no unit photo to keep, no letters home about what she'd done. The men she'd saved would never officially know her name. She was a ghost who'd saved ghosts. They'd given her a choice, the 2 officers in the windowless room at Naval Station Norfolk. Disappear quietly, or face an Article 32 hearing for operating a surgical airway without physician supervision in a combat zone. The records would be sealed regardless. The decorations would be buried. The mission would be redacted so thoroughly that official history would forget she'd ever existed. Some choices aren't really choices. They're just instructions dressed up in the language of consent. She'd chosen the scrubs. She'd chosen the nursing license. She'd chosen invisibility again, a second time, but this time in a hospital instead of a war zone. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The man next to her shifted in his seat, and his shaking hand brushed against hers. He pulled away quickly, embarrassed. "Sorry," he whispered. Megan shook her head slightly. "Not your fault." Her voice came out softer than she intended. The tremor in his hands mirrored hers, the involuntary fine motor dysfunction that came from holding things together when everything was falling apart. Holding gauze packs. Holding pressure. Holding life inside bodies that wanted to spill everything out onto sand and concrete and the red dust of a place that stopped feeling real after the first 3 hours of fire. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. They were both waiting for their names to be called. They were both used to waiting. Megan's badge had been suspended that morning. Hargrove's investigation, the fabricated complaints, the emergency hospital board meeting, all of it had moved with surgical precision. She'd been escorted out by security at 11:45, her credentials photographed, documented, filed. A nurse in good standing one day. A liability the next. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she understood it. Hargrove had been competent about it. Strategic. He'd pulled references from her nursing program, made calls to her preceptors, contacted the board members who actually mattered in the hospital's invisible hierarchy. The man wasn't stupid. He was simply afraid of a woman who didn't need his approval to function, who'd questioned his protocols in front of residents, who'd made him look slow when speed mattered. Fear made men dangerous. What she couldn't stop thinking about was the look on the SEAL's face, Commander Patterson, when he'd realized she was the O'Brien he'd heard about in Ramadi. He was awake by then, lucid enough to understand that the woman who'd whispered to him during his semi-conscious state asking him to stay present, to keep fighting, to not let go, was the same woman who'd held his platoon together 9 years ago when Taliban rounds had shredded their convoy. He'd tried to tell Hargrove. The patient himself had tried to explain. But Hargrove had already written his narrative: emotionally compromised nurse, unauthorized contact, scope violation. The story was closed before anyone thought to ask the patient what he actually knew. A nurse emerged from the hallway holding a clipboard. O'Brien? Not senior chief. Not petty officer. Just the last name, neutral and stripped of context. Megan stood. The tremor in her right hand was visible now, the fine trembling that she'd learned to hide by keeping her hands busy. Surgery had been her world once. Surgical hands had saved lives. Medical hands had kept men breathing in impossible conditions. Now those same hands shook in a VA waiting room while other people decided whether the shaking meant she was fit to work. The nurse who'd called her name was young, maybe 26, with the kind of naive competence that came from never having been broken. "Right this way," she said pleasantly. Megan followed, her footsteps quiet on the linoleum floor. Behind her, the other veterans continued waiting. The man with the magazine turned another page he wouldn't read. The man staring at the ceiling kept counting. Across the city in the conference room on the second floor of Mercy General, Dr. Hargrove was preparing his presentation. The board meeting was scheduled for 1400. Chen and Walsh had confirmed attendance. He had his files organized, performance reviews going back 18 months, incident reports he'd personally typed up, witness statements from staff members who owed him favors. He'd made 43 phone calls in the past 8 hours. 43 strategic conversations to people who had influence, authority, connections. He'd mentioned budget concerns. He'd suggested liability exposure. He'd used the phrase of practicing beyond scope so many times that it had started to feel like established fact. By 1400, the O'Brien problem would officially become her termination. The board would vote. He would deliver it personally, professionally, with the kind of measured tone that made injustice sound like procedure. What he didn't know was that at 1347, Daniel O'Brien would push through the main entrance of Mercy General carrying a wooden display case his mother had shown him once, years ago, before she'd been ordered to forget it existed. What he didn't know was that the hospital's main lobby would fill with afternoon traffic, families visiting patients, staff transitioning shifts, the chaos of a teaching hospital at peak hours. What he didn't know was that a man in dress whites would be standing near the information desk, talking quietly with a hospital administrator, and that 2 other men in dark suits would be waiting near the elevator bank, checking their watches. Hargrove had made his moves perfectly, with competence and precision, building his case brick by brick, call by call. He'd forgotten that he wasn't the only person in the room who knew how to plan. The phone rang on Megan's doctor's desk at 1358. The tremor evaluation had taken 40 minutes. Mild involuntary motor dysfunction. Consistent with combat stress syndrome. Recommendations: continue current medication regimen, consider increasing therapy frequency. Standard outcome for a veteran with classified service. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with the patient eyes of someone who'd seen this movie play out 1,000 times, had written her a prescription for increased anxiety medication. "You should rest," she'd said. "Take some time. Let yourself heal." Megan had nodded because that's what you did in these rooms. You accepted the guidance. You took your paperwork. You thanked the doctor and walked out into a hallway that looked exactly like every other hospital hallway she'd ever worked in, which meant she looked exactly like every other person in it, invisible, interchangeable, forgotten. The hospital administrator had just hung up with Naval Intelligence. The message was simple: something would be happening in the next hour. They needed security ready. They needed the board meeting to continue as scheduled. They needed cameras rolling. It wasn't a request. It was a command structured as a courtesy call. Norfolk was a Navy town. Mercy General was a Navy town's hospital. When the Pentagon called and used certain words, institutional hierarchies suddenly became very flexible. The administrator had nodded along, his hand sweating slightly, already calculating how this would look in the press release he'd eventually have to write. Megan stood in the parking lot of the VA hospital and felt the tremor move through her hands like electricity with nowhere to go. Her badge was gone. Her job was gone. Her identity as a nurse had been erased in the span of a morning, the same way her identity as a decorated service member had been erased 9 years ago. She'd been invisible twice now, once as a ghost who saved ghosts, and once as a nurse whose hands had been steady enough to save a Navy SEAL's life but not steady enough to protect herself. The cost of invisibility, she understood now, was that when you finally became visible, you'd already lost everything that visibility was supposed to protect. She was still waiting for her real name to be called. She was still standing in a room full of people who didn't know who she was. The difference now was that she'd stopped believing anyone ever would. She checked her phone. No messages. Hargrove's files had been thorough. Her references had been contacted. The nursing board would receive their paperwork by end of business. By next week, her license would be reviewed. By the week after, she'd be unemployable in any hospital in Virginia. The system worked perfectly when you understood how it worked. Hargrove understood. He'd used it like a weapon, and weapons were his strongest language. But he still didn't understand that he was standing in a room with 3 other people who spoke that language fluently, who'd been waiting for the right moment, who'd already made their calls too. The silence before a revelation is a particular kind of silence. It sounds like nothing because everything is about to break. The board meeting lasted exactly 4 minutes before the main entrance doors swung open hard enough to bang against the wall. Daniel O'Brien was 17, built like his mother, lean muscle and absolute certainty, and he carried a wooden display case the size of a jewelry box the way soldiers carry ammunition. His voice cracked when he spoke, not from fear but from the weight of what he was about to say. "Mom, they need to see these." The lobby of Mercy General went silent. Not the polite silence of a waiting room. The silence before thunder. Megan sat in a plastic chair near the elevators, her badge already gone, when her son walked through those doors. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Everyone in that lobby turned toward the voice, the staff who'd avoided her eyes at shift change, the board members who'd called for her termination, the families waiting for news that would reshape their lives. Daniel's shoes clicked on the tile floor as he approached the administrative office where his mother sat with her hands folded and her composure intact, even though her son had just walked into the worst moment of her professional life carrying proof of everything she'd never been allowed to say. "My mother," Daniel said, his voice steadier now, is Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, United States Navy. He opened the case. The room didn't just go silent. The room forgot how to breathe. Inside that wooden case, pressed against cream velvet backing, lay medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, each one catching the fluorescent lights like a piece of the sun had been hammered into metal. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And at the end, positioned alone on its own silk cushion, the Navy Cross. A trauma nurse, Morrison, who'd brought Megan coffee once and then never again after Hargrove made it clear, stood up from the back of the lobby with trembling hands. Someone had given her the declassified file, the one that had been sealed for 7 years. Her voice broke as she read, Operation Ramadi, March 2016. 3 Navy SEALs, Alpha Team, sustained multiple shrapnel injuries under sustained fire. Duration of medical support, 9 hours. Casualty count prevented, 3. Medic designation, Senior Chief O'Brien. The casualty count prevented. 3 men who would have died on that dirt floor, 3 bodies that would have been sent home in boxes, 3 families that would have received the knock on the door that changes everything. All of it prevented by hands that Mercy General had just escorted out with a suspended badge. Then the doors opened again, and Captain Patterson walked in wearing the dress uniform of a Navy SEAL, dress blues so immaculate they looked tailored by precision itself. He was thick through the shoulders like a man who'd been through things that rewire muscle and bone. His eyes found Megan's and held them for a single moment, and in that moment was 7 years of classified silence, of letters he couldn't send, of knowing exactly who'd kept him breathing when breathing seemed impossible. He approached the display case and began pinning the medals to Megan's scrubs with the deliberate ceremony of someone honoring something sacred. Each medal went on with the same careful precision she'd used 7 years ago when her hands moved without thinking because her hands didn't need to think, they just needed to work. "Bronze Star," he said, pinning it. His voice carried the weight of command. "For exceptional service under fire." A second later, another medal. "Silver Star." For heroism in combat. The lobby had become a cathedral. Cameras were appearing, someone had called news crews, or they'd arrived because news always smells a story before it becomes one, and their lights made the medals shine like they were glowing from inside. 2 purple hearts, Patterson continued, his hands moving with the same steady certainty Megan's had shown at 0300 when her seal was drowning in his own blood. Combat wounds. 3 tours. 9 years of service that official record said never happened. The last medal was the Navy Cross. There was nothing casual about the Navy Cross. Only the Medal of Honor ranked higher, and you could fit the number of living Navy Cross recipients in a gymnasium. Patterson's hand shook, not from weakness but from understanding exactly what he was doing. He was pulling a ghost from the shadows. He was making invisible visible. "And the Navy Cross," he said, his voice the voice of someone who'd nearly died and been saved by the hands of the person standing in front of him. "For extraordinary heroism. For saving my life. For saving our team. For operating under conditions that would have broken anyone else, and choosing to save lives instead of breaking." The medal pinned to her scrubs, catching light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward then, moving through the crowd like they'd done this before, which they had. Naval intelligence moves differently than civilians move. They have the confidence of people who've been inside classified operations, who've seen what stays buried, who carry secrets the way soldiers carry weight. One of them carried the kind of credential that makes hospital security step aside without being asked. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien," he said, not reading from anything, just stating facts. "Operation Ramady has been declassified as of 0800 this morning. Your service record has been unsealed. You are hereby recalled to active duty, effective immediately, as Director of Combat Medical Training for Naval Special Warfare Group 2. Your rank is confirmed. Your decorations are official. Your record is no longer a ghost story. It's history." The words hung in the air like they'd weight them down, like they were too big to fit inside the lobby of a civilian hospital. Admiral Vance stepped forward then, and the way he moved made it clear that the person giving the orders had just changed. He looked at Dr. Hargrove, who stood near the administrative office with his face the color of old institutional paint, and he spoke with the kind of calm that comes from having absolute authority and zero patience. "Dr. Hargrove, you have compromised a protected service member operating under classified military orders. You fabricated evidence against a decorated combat veteran. You endangered a naval officer by initiating an investigation designed to discredit her immediately after she saved the life of one of your patients." Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You are terminated," Admiral Vance said. "Effective immediately. Security." The same 2 guards who'd escorted Megan out with her empty hands and suspended badge approached Hargrove, and watching someone who'd held power dissolve when that power is taken is like watching someone learn that gravity is real. He tried to speak. "I was protecting standards." "You were protecting your ego," Vance said. His voice was ice. "While you were making calls to board members, Senior Chief O'Brien was saving lives. While you fabricated complaints, she performed a perfect pericardiocentesis that Navy surgeons will use as a training example for the next decade. You looked at competence and saw a threat. You looked at quiet strength and saw weakness. You were wrong." The guard's hands were light on his arms, not rough, just firm, as they moved him toward the exit. His badge landed in a trash can near the nurse's station. The sound it made was small and final. News cameras followed him out, phones recording, the moment of destruction playing out in real time for people who hadn't known 5 minutes ago that their sense of authority had been an illusion. Megan held her son. Daniel's arms went around her, and she let him because sometimes composure means knowing when to let someone else hold you up. Flashbulbs popped, bright enough to wash out everything else, bright enough that the medals on her scrubs became nothing but light. Captain Patterson's wife appeared from somewhere in the crowd and embraced Megan, crying in the way people cry when they understand they'd almost lost someone forever. The staff began approaching one by one, Morrison first, shame-faced, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up." Then others. A resident Megan had trained, "You taught me more than anyone here." The nurses from the night shift stood in a cluster, unable to meet her eyes, finally understanding that they'd abandoned someone who'd been saving lives while they were saving themselves. Megan nodded to each of them, no speeches, just quiet acknowledgement of what it meant to have been invisible and then, suddenly, to be seen by everyone at once. She reached inside her jacket and touched the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the one she'd been running her thumb across during every shift for 7 years, that small piece of fabric that carried the weight of 9 hours in remedy of 3 men who'd lived because her hands knew what to do. She touched it once more, and this time it wasn't a secret anymore. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove at Norfolk Community College teaching CPR certification for $15 an hour. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy to bored students, his hands shaking as he counted out loud, 28, 29, 30. 2 students recognized him from the viral video, the moment that had been watched 6 million times, the moment his professional life collapsed in real time. They left mid-class without a word. His voice wavered on the compressions, and nobody stayed to listen. Across town at Naval Special Warfare Group 2, Senior Chief O'Brien stood before a class of 40 combat medics wearing her Navy working uniform, her medals displayed in a shadow box behind her. She demonstrated the same pericardiocentesis that had saved Captain Patterson, teaching on simulation mannequins, her hands moving with the same precision that had kept a Navy SEAL breathing when everything else was failing. A young corpsman asked, "Senior Chief, what if command says you can't?" Her answer came without hesitation, "When regulations mean nothing and only skill stands between your teammate and the dark, you do what's right." Captain Patterson, now promoted, observed from the back of the classroom. Daniel O'Brien, enrolled in the Naval Academy's pre-med program, took notes in the front row, understanding finally that his mother's quiet strength had never been weakness, it had been the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because it speaks through lives saved and people who walk out of trauma bays when they should be dead. That evening, Megan sat in her office at Naval Special Warfare Group 2 at 2,200 hours, reviewing training protocols, the faded unit patch now framed on her wall beside the Navy Cross. She touched the glass once, just once, then returned to work because that's what people who've been invisible for 7 years do when they're finally given the chance to be seen. They work. They teach. They make sure the next person who looks at a quiet nurse doesn't make the mistake of mistaking composure for weakness. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you made it this far, you understand why quiet strength matters more than loud authority. Subscribe for more stories about people who change everything while nobody's watching. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated. Comment, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?